thank you for joining us for our webinar on the Department of Labor Law updates. We have an excellent presenter today, Robert Kirkland from the New Jersey Department of Labor. He is the Bureau Chief of Inspection for Strategic and General Enforcement. He was a speaker with us last year in November at our convention and gave us an excellent presentation on all the pertinent labor laws, tip credits, and all of those things. And obviously with things that are changing and going on in the state, we felt it was important to update our members in providing them some information on what's going on and what needs to be done. And if you're not doing it, because I'm sure everyone knows, no one wants a Department of Labor Law audit at your establishment. So we thought this would be an excellent idea to bring Mr. Kirkland here to speak with us. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Thanks, Diane. Good morning, everyone. So as Diane mentioned, I did come down to Atlantic City in November. I had a great time, presented a lot of information. I have a very similar slideshow presentation to kind of go over and share my screen with everybody just to kind of walk through it. However, I find a lot when it comes to these kind of things, I don't want to just sit here and read a screen and tell you exactly what it says. I'd rather give you guys the opportunity, if you have questions or specific issues that you want to talk about, I am happy to kind of go over and share the information that I have with you guys. As she mentioned, I am the Bureau Chief of Inspection for our General and Strategic Enforcement. So that covers basically everything in the state of New Jersey that is not construction related. I have over 25 years of experience doing this. I wrote multiple policies, investigation practices for our office. I handled all kinds of cases, so I have quite a bit of experience, and I'm happy to share that with you when it comes to specific situations. I mentioned back in November that this particular industry is something where we're trying to focus on some outreach, because a lot of our higher dollar cases come from this industry, and it directly involves tips and not paying the proper cash wage for a tipped employee, where you guys then lose the tip credit and you have to pay everybody the full minimum wage on top of what they've already received. So we're trying to share this information and get it out to you guys to avoid hundreds of thousands of dollars in back wages, penalties, fines, and fees that can be avoided. So I'm going to go over a whole bunch of information here. When you see these specific rates, one thing I want to make sure that I mention, I'm not here taking roll call or inventory of restaurants. We're not coming out, based upon everybody being proactive and being part of this. I want to share this information so that you guys can go back and double check your records and self-correct any issues that you potentially have or that you think may occur, specifically when it comes to paying the right cash wage to workers where you would lose the tip credit. Please, if you find this problem, go back and self-correct, make up the difference, and I'll get to it. I'll go into it a little bit more detail when we get over the specific rates. But I'd rather you self-correct the difference in the rates rather than lose the entire tip credit to your workers. So with that, I'm going to start to share my screen.
Again, if you have a question, you can hit the raise your hand, or feel free to type it into the screen and in the chat, and I will be happy to ask the question for you.
All right. So first, everybody can hear me. Everybody can see. We're all good to go, right? All right. So this again is a business-focused presentation. We do a lot of these worker-focused presentations. However, I understand this is the different side of it. So you're going to get similar material that we tell workers, but you're just going to get it in a little different, more of a format so that you guys can be proactive and prevent any issues. I'd like to think that all of our investigators are friendly and cordial, where it's not that much of an inconvenience. However, I understand going through a labor audit is not much fun. We take up a lot of time, a lot of space, and then ultimately at the end, you're looking at, potentially to pay a lot of money back. So we want to avoid that and kind of give you this information first. Quick disclaimer, again, this isn't legal advice. I'm not here to make sure or to certify that everything you're doing is on board. This is basically just us kind of giving you an overview of the most updated laws and regulations that as a business owner you should be aware of, especially in your industry, okay? And I did mention before, I'm going to share this presentation back out with Diane, so she'll be able to share it with you as needed or as requested. But again, this isn't necessarily just me acting as a lawyer or giving you guys legal advice as to what you should do. Some of the topics that we'll talk about: minimum wage, records, overtime, earned sick leave, which is a big one, child labor, your industry, maybe there's not so much child labor, but then right now, one of the hot topics and what we're seeing a lot of is retaliation complaints. So we're going to discuss a little bit about retaliation issues. So if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions, just feel free to chime in. I can't really see everybody's participant since I'm sharing my screen, but Diane, if you see something, just jump in and let me know, okay?
Okay.
All right, so some responsibilities. Maintaining records. This is a big one, right? You got to keep a records for the hours of work, how much they're being paid, and you got to keep that on a regular basis. It's not one of those things where we keep a time card, we call it into the payroll service, and then we throw it away. You're responsible for keeping a record of the daily and the weekly hours for all of your employees. Employees have to be paid the minimum wage. Anybody who works over 40 hours has to be paid overtime at least twice a month. You can do it on the 15th and the 30th, bi-weekly, weekly, however you want to do it, but it has to be at least twice a month. Big thing for your industry is illegal deductions, breakages, shortages, people skipping out on checks. We get a lot of complaints from waitresses, waiters. Oh, I broke a plate, they charged me. Or a customer skipped out on a bill and they took it, they made me pay for the bill. That's all illegal. You cannot do that. You cannot require your employees to do that. At this point, since 2018, everybody should be aware of the earned sick leave law. If you're not, please use these resources and make sure you come into compliance with the earned sick leave law. This is something that your employees earn 1 hour for every 30 that they work, or you advance them 40 hours up front. Retaliation against workers if they have a wage complaint. Our office gets a lot of retaliation questions, but we really only deal with retaliation when it comes to asserting a wage claim. If they come to you and complain about their wages or have a question about their wages, or they come to us with a question about their wages, that is asserting a claim. You cannot then in turn retaliate against them because they asked you a question or filed a complaint or want to get some basic information about their wages. Under 18, again, nobody under 18 should be serving alcohol. They could be clearing alcohol. They could be, working as a hostess, something along those lines. But again, we should not be having anybody serving alcohol under the age of 18. Properly classifying their employees. We don't see much of that in this industry. Again, that's, trying to say somebody's an independent contractor. The problem we find in this industry is paying cash to workers off the books. If you're doing that, that's also misclassification. So all the employees have to be paid on the books, and they have to be paid. You can pay them cash, but you got to pay them on the books. You got to show a record of the gross deductions in the net, but you can pay them in cash. And then carrying workers' comp. Again, we don't enforce workers' comp. We just make sure you're carrying it when we come through. Let's see. Scroll down. All right, minimum wage. January 1st, 2025, the minimum wage went up, right? It's now $15.49 for most employers, small and seasonal employers. That's anybody with less than 6. It's $14.53. If you as the employer want to make the claim that you're a small or seasonal employer, that's your burden to prove to the Department of Labor that you qualify for one of these exemptions to pay less than the full minimum wage. Cash wages for tipped workers, you'll see right here, is now $562. So we'll get into that a little bit more specific. But that is the minimum amount of money that you have to pay your worker in cash. And when I say in cash, that's, via a paycheck. Everything else can come in the form of tips. You see here, it went up from $526 from the year before. So a lot of times we get employers, well, I didn't know, or I wasn't aware of that increase. So here's your notice. It increased. You should be aware of it. You should check every January. It's most likely going to continue to go up every January. But for now, it went up from $526 to $562. So please make sure you're paying your workers at least $562 an hour who are receiving tips. This is just a little bit of the back history behind your small employer minimum wages. Again, for the current calendar year, they have to have fewer than 6 employees during a majority of the work weeks. And the previous calendar year, right? So these are so these go hand in hand together. So if you're claiming that you're a small employer, you have to make sure that you meet both number 1 and number 2. All right. So before we go there, is there any questions that I'm not seeing or anything? No? All right. So minimum wage for tipped workers. We just talked about this is $562. You are allowed to pay your employee $562 or higher in a paycheck. Right? The $562 is the minimum. And then you can claim up to the difference of the $987 for a tip credit. So all of their tips only go towards the minimum wage. They don't go into overtime. The next bullet point you see here, if an employer fails to pay the minimum cash wage, they cannot use a tip credit and need to pay the full minimum wage. So what you're seeing, or what we're seeing a lot of, is now in 2025, nobody, or some people, didn't increase it from $526 to $562. So now when we come through and we do an investigation or an audit, we take away that entire tip credit and we now make you pay the difference, right? From the back here, if we go back to the other screen, $15.49, right? Which is the full minimum wage, as opposed to the $562. So what we're asking you to do is check your books and make sure that you did the increase. And if you did not increase them from $526 to $562, pay them that difference as a retro check to bring you into compliance with the actual cash wage. If I had my preference, we wouldn't even really be using the word cash wage, right? Especially in this industry, because if I think of cash wages, that's cash tips that I'm getting as a worker. However, in the way that it's written in the law and the regulations, the cash wages pertains to what you're paying your workers by the hour. So you must pay them $562 an hour if you want to claim their tips. Nothing here tells you that you can't pay them more per hour, but you must pay them at least $562 an hour if you want to take a tip credit.
Mr. Kirkland, I have a question, if that's possible. I discovered in the second week of March that I did not change the rate over for my tipped employees. I compensated them through a check, added up their hours, and compensated them that way. Should I have put that through the payroll system, or should I have just compensated them through a handwritten check?
Preferably, I would tell you that it should be through the payroll system, right? Because again, their wages are taxable. Mm-hmm. However, if you were to show one of our investigators that say, they came through and they see this, you have a check, right? It's not like you as an employer, oh, well, I paid them cash and I made up the difference. We're not going to believe you. You might be the most honest man in the world, but if you tell me I paid them in cash, we're just going to simply say that didn't happen. So by paying them by a check and having a record of what you paid them to show that you retroactively made up that difference, we'll accept it. And we're not necessarily the taxing authority, right? We're the wage authority. So we work hand in hand. We have task force with, workers' comp, employer accounts, where we refer things back and forth to each other. So employer accounts, they're the auditing mechanism that handles like your temporary disability, your unemployment, family leave, and all, family leave insurance and stuff like that. We'll refer that back to them. But something as small as, 10 workers and you're paying them $30, from January to March, we're not going to make that referral back to them, right? Quite honestly, they're not really interested in that tiny little bit of tax, dollars. But again, remember, these are wages. They should be on the books.
Yeah.
You should be there. But if you have a record of it, that's great. You can prove that, look, I made a mistake. I'm human. I corrected my mistake, and there's no loss here to anybody.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Sure, no problem. The biggest thing to remember here when it comes to overtime for tipped workers, overtime is calculated based only on the minimum wage. So whenever they work over 40 hours, it's 1.5 times the current minimum wage. The tips do not count to their rate of pay to determine their overtime. So, a little bit of savings to you, the employer, that way, where you don't have to include their tips and pay them at a higher rate of pay for the overtime. The overtime rate for tipped workers is only 1.5 times the minimum wage.
Rob, I have a question. Is the minimum wage based on the per day or per week?
This is based on per week. Okay. So if there's a slow day that somebody didn't make a whole lot of tips, there's no requirement for you to make up the minimum wage on tips or give them additional money on a daily basis. Each work week stands alone. And even if you pay your employees on a bi-weekly basis, each week is going to stand alone. So our investigators are trained to treat each week alone, so that I'm going to come in and I'm going to say, for this set 7-day period, right, you as an employer, you're required to set a work week, whether it's, Wednesday to Tuesday, Sunday to Saturday, that's your choice. You pick it, you tell them in advance. But we'll take that 7-day period and then we'll divide the number of hours that they work by the wages and the tips that they made in that 7-day period to make sure that they're in compliance with the minimum wage.
All right. Okay. Thank you. That's good.
All right. So now we kind of get into who is a tipped worker and who's not a tipped worker. A tipped employer or tipped employee has to be somebody doing a job that customarily receives tips. You can't just say, well, somebody got a $30 tip, so now they're a tipped worker. They have to customarily be in a job that accepts tips or that gets tips. And it is $30 a month is the minimum. So if somebody's getting $30 a month in a minimum of tips, and they do a job that's customarily assigned to getting tips, then they can be considered a tipped worker. But tips belong to the employee, whether or not you take a tip credit. So tips belong to the employee. It's specified in the law and the reg that as an employer, you cannot take the tips. The tips belong to the employees. Let's see. I mean, the rest of this is pretty much kind of self-explanatory. Again, it's, only the tips kept that go to the employee. So say, there's a tip pool and you split up the tips, only the portion that each particular employee in a tip pool gets can be counted. You can't just take the full tip credit for the full $30 for the same, for multiple people. It's each portion of what somebody receives is their actual tips. All right, so tip credit, you're not required to take a tip credit. You can, and you're allowed to, and it's going to save you some money if you do take a tip credit. But you can pay your workers the full minimum wage if you want, but you are allowed to use a portion of their tips towards the minimum wage. We already went over the rates of what the cash rate, the 562, and then the difference of the 987 goes the tip credit is the per hour of in tips that you're allowed to count towards the minimum wage. Here's what we get a lot of is the employer's responsibility to demonstrate that the employees got their tips. This industry, right, is tough, as we all know. Not everybody's going to come to you at the end of the night and tell you, well, I made $200 tonight in cash tips, right? They're only going to tell you that they made a certain amount of money in tips. But remember, it's you as the employer. It's your obligation to keep a record of the tips and to get that information from your employees. I'm not going to sit here and advocate for you to get rid of employees. I know how hard it is to find good employees or those kind of things. But when the laws are enforced, it pushes the burden on you, the employer, to keep the records and to get the amount of tips that your workers are making on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. It's your responsibility. They don't want to give it to you. You can deal with that how you see fit. But remember, we're not going to accept, well, my employee didn't want to tell me. We can't operate like that. Unfortunately, you have the obligation to get the tips, record the tips, and make sure that information is true and accurate. All right, this 80-20 rule, it's highly debated. We kept it in there for now because nothing's changed. This is another one of those, legislative changes that may happen over the next 6-7 months, getting rid of this 80-20 rule. You're going to see a lot of this when tipped workers are performing non-tipped activities. Say you need somebody to clean a bathroom or, help unload a truck or something along those lines. For now, you need to follow the 80-20 rule. So that if somebody is spending 20% or less of their time doing non-tipped work, you're okay. But when they spend more than 20% of their time doing non-tipped activities, now again, you'll have to keep the hours. You'll have to keep a record of the hours that they're doing these things. If somebody spends more than 20% unloading trucks, cleaning bathrooms, sweeping the floor, something along those lines that's not, incidental to their job, you then have to pay them the full minimum wage for those hours of non-tipped activity. Again, this could change. This is on the hot button to be changed. But as it currently stands, the 80-20 rule is still in effect. Let's see. Oh, so that was before. All right. If you,
I have one question. So you're saying that it's possibly going to change the 80-20 rule. Who's looking to make that change?
That is actually a U.S. Department of Labor rule.
That's you. Okay.
Yeah. So there's ongoing court battles with some U.S. regulations and stuff. So it's tricky because the federal rules and the state rules change. And again, unfortunately for you guys, the employers, the standard is you must comply with whatever is more beneficial to the employee. So if the federal standard is more beneficial to the worker, you have to comply with that. If the state standard, is more beneficial to the worker, then you have to comply with that whenever there's a difference. Okay. So New Jersey's tried to make that simple, and at least when it comes to the overtime portions, right? We've adopted federal regulations for overtime exemptions. So we tried to kind of make it a little bit easier, but not everything matches. Not everything is the same, especially minimum wage, right? We have a way higher minimum wage. So that's why you have to follow the New Jersey minimum wage as opposed to the federal minimum wage. For the longest time, it was just the $2.13 an hour, right? That's long gone, right? New Jersey now has the higher standard that the $5.62 is what applies. So, whenever there's a difference, you, the employer, make sure you follow whatever standard is more beneficial to the workers. Now, the catch here. If you want to take a tip credit for your workers, you have to tell them in advance of the following. The cash wage that will be paid, right? Again, that's the hourly rate, $5.62. There's no need to pay them any more. You can if you want. Right? You can be the nicer employer. You want to pay them higher, you're more than welcome to do so. My 25 years of experience here, well, one thing I've learned, the nicer you are to your employees, the more advantage of you they will take. You're going to tell them the amount of the tip credit, which will be claimed, right? Which may not exceed the value of the tips actually received. So again, that's the difference between the tip, the cash wage to the minimum wage. You're going to tell them this is what we're declaring as your tip. And then all tips must be retained by the employee, except in a case where there's a valid tip pool, right? And then they have to, make their splits at the end of the day, at the end of the week, whatever it is, pursuant to your valid tip pool. If you haven't told your employees of this in advance, you can't take a tip credit. This almost rarely never happens. Most people know well in advance, right? When you hire somebody, how much they're going to be paid by the hour and stuff like that. You tell them all in advance. This is just an extra caveat to try to make sure that you're telling your employees what you're getting, when you're getting it, and how you're going to get it. So please just tell your employees in advance. All right.
Franklin Sunday.
I would tell you that tip pooling is probably one of the most complicated things to deal with, especially from an enforcement aspect of it. This industry, probably not so much because, you have your food runners, your bussers, your servers. And if you're going to pool your tips, it's easily traceable. This kind of is a little bit more challenging for, your ice cream stands or your Ritas or coffee shops where they have like a cup in front of the register and people are putting in money and sharing the thing. What you need to do and remember the most here when it comes to a tip pool, if you're going to do that, is right here in bold in the middle, which is notify all of your employees about the tip pool, how much they have to contribute, and then, what's going to happen to those tips. Non-tipped employees like managers, right? Your shift manager, your regional manager, your assistant manager, your kitchen manager, they are not a tipped employee. They cannot be part of the tip pool. So again, a tip pool has to be considered, to be part of the tip pool, you have to be considered a tipped employee. We went over that before, which what is considered a tipped employee is somebody who's making at least $30 a month, and then their job customarily receives tips for what they do. Where you're taking a tip credit from the tip pool, an employee must receive at least the state minimum wage. If it's less, you have to make up the difference. If you're taking tips and sharing them, sometimes some people do better than others, and you're just going to have to be cautious at the end of the week. Again, total money earned divided by total hours worked to make sure that it's at least minimum wage. If it's not, as the employer, you're required to make up the difference. This is the biggest one. Service charges. Right here in red at the top, a service charge is not a tip. This came up a lot. We talked about this in November. So if anybody was there, you remember we kind of got into this a little bit. You're 18% for parties of 6 or more, or if you're having a banquet and you have an automatic, service charge that's not a gratuity, right? Those service charges are not a tip, and it doesn't get counted. You can share it, you can keep it, you can do whatever you want with it. All right. It's not a tip where it has to go to the employee. It's a service charge. And as the employer, it's your job to choose what you want to do with that extra service charge. Most people just share it with their employees. We get that complaint quite often. You see this a lot in like catering or banquets or wedding venues, stuff like that is, oh, well, my employer didn't give me the 18% or they didn't share it. Unfortunately, we can't do anything with that. That's you. That's your job as the employer. That's your choice to share it, to keep it, to do what you want. It's not a tip. Says it right here. You've heard it from me that it is a service charge is not a tip. You don't have to share that with your workers. I see a question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. I wanted to ask a question on the previous slide also, but I'll stay on this one. If you do share it though, so we really consider that as a tip that goes to the employees. That could go and should go towards a tip credit, correct?
Yeah, it's still considered a wage. So, it's not technically a tip, but it is a wage. It's income, right? So it's taxable. So you're putting it on their payroll. and then it gets counted towards their regular hourly wage. It's taxable and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
All right. You want to go back to the last slide?
Yeah, only because of with regard to the pool tip pools. One of the things that I think, just for benefit of others here, like if an employee, what we have them do if they have to tip into our busser pool, that's the only pool we have, because the bussers, which are food runners, it's all in the same grouping. They're supporting multiple people throughout the day. And if that one server, say, gets more credit card tips than cash tips, they might actually put more cash out than they actually got that are going to show up on their paycheck from the credit card tips. So we also allow them to put a negative in there to say they actually paid money out, which would reduce the tip credit. So that's something that needs to be looked at also.
Yeah, and again, right, so as long as you, the employer, have that record of it and you can explain it, then it's going to be considered. What we just can't go on, oh, well, they paid out cash and this is what it is, right? As long as you have the record of what it is that you're paying out and where the money's going into the pool, so that, remember what we deal with, right? I don't deal with employers calling me, making complaints about employees. I deal with employees calling our office and sending emails nonstop about, well, my employer did this. My employer took this. My employer's doing this. Do I have a right? My employer's doing this. Can I make a complaint or can I sue them? So we get these questions. The biggest thing I can tell you when it comes to those kind of things, and as long as you're documenting it and as long as your employees are fully aware of what you're doing and what's going on with their money, you're going to be okay. Records, I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on the records, but again, what you need to know for records is you got to keep them for 6 years. All right. There's a labor law requirement that says you got to keep them for 6 years, but this is just in general, you can be sued going back for 6 years. Right. There's a civil rule 2A where you can make a complaint for money going back 6 years. You're better off keeping your records for a 6-year period to protect yourself. One thing you'll notice that's not here on the record keeping requirement is a social security number. It's not a Labor Department issue. It's not a state of New Jersey issue. That's a federal issue. That's a federal number. We don't ask for it. We don't want it. You're not required to keep it. You can't get cited in New Jersey, at least from the New Jersey Department of Labor, for a social security number. You need their name, address, rate of pay, right? Again, make sure we're telling them at least $5.62 an hour, gross deductions net, how they're being paid, pay date, and then a record of their earned sick leave, what they've accrued and what they've used. Right. One of the biggest violations that we see here is daily time records. A lot of times it's, well, we kept it on a time card and then we called it into ADP and then we threw our time cards away and we didn't keep our record of the daily hours. Unfortunately, daily hours is still required to be kept, so that you have to have a record of each day and each week that your employees work. There's the 6-year requirement. Time records must be true and accurate to the work. Again, remember the burden here is on you, the employer, to track the hours that your employees work. Not so much in this industry, right? Because people are coming to an actual place. They're coming to a physical location. Somebody can see them. Somebody can keep an eye on them. But we see a lot of times where, workers or employers will say, well, I couldn't pay them because they didn't turn in their hours to me. That doesn't count. You, the employer, you have to keep the record. You have to know how many hours your employees are working, and in turn, corresponds to the pay that you're paying them at the end of the week or every 2 weeks.
Mr. Kirkland, I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
For records, so ADP on a payroll, you can add a specific algorithm or whatever you want to call it, a timekeeping track for sick hours. Is that considered a viable timekeeping track? So whatever hours you enter that they work that coincides with toast will actually keep the hours of sick hours acquired up to.
Yeah. So we're gonna get into the sick hours, right? So two things. That will comply because when it comes to sick leave, you're going to have to record how many hours they've earned, how many hours they've used, and how many hours they have left, right?
Yes.
So an ADP will be able to show that, but that still doesn't meet the daily requirement, right? The record to keep that weekly sheet or that time card. So I've never seen ADP have like a daily time record, right? They're able to show you at the end of the week or the end of every 2 weeks how many hours somebody worked.
Mm-hmm.
So that is sufficient for the earned sick leave records, but that's not necessarily compliant with the general requirement to keep a record of the daily hours.
No, understood. Thank you for answering that.
Sure. If you have minors working for you, big things, right? In and out times, they need to come in, they need to record when they start their work. And then they need to report when they went out for a meal period, when they came back from the meal period, and then when they signed off at the end of the day. Meal periods right now for minors are after 6 hours of work. They must have a documented 30-minute meal period. So you have to write it down. You have to make them clock in. You have to make them clock out. I've seen people, apply the letter of the law where somebody punched in and out for only a 28-minute meal period, and they didn't give them credit for taking a full 30-minute meal period. That's probably on the way extreme side. However, as an employer, just be conscious of that you again must make your minors clock in and out, record in and out times, however you want to do it, of the time they start, the time they go out for their meal, and the time that they come back and finish their day. I'm not so sure if there's slides going a little bit farther about child labor. Hopefully, I'll just touch on it briefly. As we're coming up on the holiday season, right, they've gave it a little bit more leniency for the 10 hours a day for 6 days a week for the minors. So just be conscious of that you do, especially if you're down the shore or wherever, they loosen up the restrictions for the hours that minors are working or are allowed to work in the summertime. Again, here it is, right? This is employers have to keep a record of the gratuities. I told you this before. This is a requirement. It's not my requirement. It's a requirement of the law. This is what you need your employees to give to you on a regular basis. If they're not going to give it to you, I would start documenting all your attempts to try to get it. And then you kind of need to take whatever action you deem appropriate. But again, it's the employer's responsibility to get the amount of tips that the workers are making. We kind of highlighted all this, right? Notify them their rate of pay, their regular paydays. You got to pay on the regular payday. Big complaint. Oh, well, if there's a holiday on a payday, pay them the day before. Don't pay them the next day or the day after. You'll run into a problem with that. So if the payday falls on a holiday, pay them the day before, but pay your employees on their regularly scheduled paydays. If you don't, it technically constitutes a violation. You could be subject to some penalties or fees. Illegal deductions. Again, I kind of highlighted some of the biggest ones for this industry. Again, if somebody skips out on a check, that's not your server's fault. It's not your server's job to go, tackle them and make them pay their bill or those kind of things. Can't take it out of their paycheck. If they broke a plate, can't take that out of their paycheck. If somebody's short on a cash register, you can't take that out of their paycheck. And then uniforms. If you have a company shirt, company logo on it, it qualifies as a uniform. You're obligated to provide that, uniform to the worker. You give it to them at no cost. If you're requiring them to wear it, you got to give it to them. What you don't want to do is then in turn, that employee leaves or you fire them or whatever the case may be, is hold their last paycheck until they give you your shirt or your uniform back. If you do that, you run into a problem by not paying them on the regularly scheduled payday, which we just went over before. And then you're subject to a penalty and fine or a fee because you can't put any conditions upon releasing their wages to them, such as, well, I'm not paying you unless you give me my uniform back. You can't do it. It becomes illegal. Again, we talked on this before. Again, if it's a tipped employee, then the overtime is based on 1.5 times minimum wage. Anything over 40. You're not required to account for their tips into determining their overtime rate. It's just flat 1.5 times minimum wage for all the for the overtime hours. Again, we touched on this too, but I've highlighted again, everybody should be aware of the earned sick leave law. Everybody should be affording their employees the earned sick leave, the ability to accrue it and use it. This goes for seasonal employees. This goes for, and especially if you guys are, down the shore or something like that. If you had an employee who worked for you before and is coming back within a 6-month period, all of their time gets reinstated from before. They don't have to start over from zero if they're coming back to you within a 6-month period. If you have a PTO policy that says I'm going to give you X amount of days off, that PTO policy has to be equal to or better than what the earned sick leave law requires, and you're not required to give them any more time. If you have a vacation policy and you afford them, that under vacation PTO, as long as it complies with the basic requirements of the law, there's no requirement to give them an additional 40 hours of earned sick leave. But again, just make sure your policy complies with the earned sick leave law. They earn 1 hour for every 30 worked, or you can advance them 40 in the year. Be cautious if you're advancing employees 40 in the year, because once you advance it to them, that's theirs to use. Right? So we get a lot of these complaints, or a lot of these find out a lot is, I advanced somebody 40 hours starting on January 1st. They used all their time and then they quit, say June, and you, the employer, want to go back and recoup some of that money because they technically didn't accrue. You gave it to them up front. That's theirs to use. That's your loss. All right. If you give it to them up front, that's theirs. If you make them accrue it, that's okay too. These are just, a question came through. Let's see. We don't really specifically have an amount of the uniforms. That's your, at least one. If you're going to require them to have a uniform, you got to give them at least one. If they're renting the uniforms, or if it's like a Cintas type thing, you're allowed to charge a nominal fee for the cleaning of the uniforms. A lot of the cooks back in the kitchen or those kind of things, if you have, a contract with one of those type services, if you launder the uniforms for them, you can charge a nominal fee for the laundering of the uniforms. But we don't really have a requirement for how many, they should get. But again, that's going to become, if they're working 5 days a week and they're dirty and they're showing up, with dirty clothes and a dirty uniform, that's for you as the employer to address with them, not necessarily the labor department to get involved with. This is just some uses for the earned sick leave. It's not only just for themselves, but it's also for their family members. We talked before about keeping records for a 6-year period. The earned sick leave law is a little bit confusing because it tells you only have to keep them for 5. But again, keep your records for 6 years, despite what the earned sick leave record says for keeping them for 5. Keep all your records for 6 years. Again, this is what it's going to tell you, right? And this, goes to the question we had before. The earned sick leave records have to show you the hours that they work, the time that they accrued or advanced, they used, paid out, and carry over. So ADP, paychecks, those kind of services, they've all pretty much, adopted this or incorporated this into their records based upon what we see. If they're charging you an extra fee for it, that's not really, something we get involved with to keep it on there. And again, this is not something that you have to get and put on somebody's paycheck, right? But if they come to ask you, you should have that information readily available to your employees, so that if somebody says, hey, how much, sick time do I have? You can provide that information to them.
Rob, I have
Yes.
a question on the chat. I don't know if this falls into the Department of Labor, but if you have a full-time employee, is there a minimum number of uniforms that they're required to give them?
Nope. No, there's no minimum requirement. if you're going to make them wear a uniform, you got to give them at least one. If you want to give them more, that's fine. But again, if they're showing up to work with dirty clothes, then that runs into the problem of maybe I should give them an extra shirt or send them home until they can come up back with a clean uniform. But you guys, you're the employer, you get to make those rules.
Rob, can you hear me?
Yes.
So along the lines of uniforms, if say you give a logoed chef's coat out to 5 of them, say to each cook, and can you have an agreement with them if they were to leave within a certain time that they have to return those uniforms? If not, you charge them a fee per uniform and not actually withhold their last check, but deduct from their check any fee that's pre-communicated.
No, that's an illegal deduction.
Okay.
So if it's got a logo, if it's got your logo on it, then no, that becomes you cannot deduct it, you cannot charge them for it or anything else. Now that doesn't mean you can't go, sue them somewhere else for like a breach of contract. But the problem is you can't touch their wages or have them pay for it, because then that in theory becomes a diversion of their wages.
Understood. Thanks.
Sure. The one thing we talked about last time that I probably have to give a little bit better clearance on is the requirement for a note. You cannot ask an employee for a doctor's note unless they're out for 3 consecutive days. So when they're out for 3 consecutive days, requesting, right? Remember now, and again, an employee has to request to use their earned sick leave. Then you can require a note. And we kind of clarified this since the last time we met in November, that if they cannot provide that note, then there's no requirement to pay them for the 3 days. So this was a little bit more confusing the last time. We actually had a couple test cases with it. We had to, get a better interpretation of the statute. And so they go hand in hand. So if an employee wants to use the sick time, and this is the only circumstance you're allowed to ask for a note too, by the way, is when they're out for the 3 consecutive days. And if you ask for it and they can't produce it, then there's no requirement to pay them for that time, because they didn't meet their burden or their responsibility as per the statute.
Along those lines, and there's actually a good question in the chat but I wanted to stay on sick leave for a second. Say their shifts are Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they miss Monday and Wednesday. Is the consecutive days just the days they're missing with me as an employer? Because to me, that's 3 days missing, because if you're out Monday, and even though you weren't coming in Tuesday, you're also out Wednesday, you've actually been essentially sick for 3 days.
No, they'd have to miss 3 consecutive days for you.
Okay.
I have another question on uniforms. Can an employee purchase additional uniforms at a discounted rate? So if we give them 2 shirts, can they say, I want another one and I'll pay for it in $10?
I'll answer that question with another question. Are they going to be allowed to wear that out on the street? Is there a requirement that you say, oh, you can't wear my shirts anywhere else, kind of a thing? And if they're allowed to do that, then provided you give them a certain number of free of charge and they voluntarily elect to buy more shirts that they want to wear, then they can do that voluntarily, but it just can't be that minimum requirement. You can't say, I require you to have 5 uniforms. I'm giving you 4. You have to pay for the 5th. If you put that condition on it, whether this case, right, I'll give you 2, you have to buy the 3rd. You can't make that mandatory. If you give them 2 and they want more, that's their choice. But as long as you're giving them, a number of uniforms, and then that's their voluntary election, then go ahead. You can do that.
Good. Got it.
Let's see. I would tell you here where it says, All posters can be downloaded on the Department of Labor website. We're currently, in a big overhaul of changing a lot of our outreach materials, our brochures. So you might not get the most updated information on our website. There's a disclaimer on there that says, we're working on it, we're updating it. I would tell you this, that if you get, companies coming, soliciting or saying, hey, buy the new updated posters, you don't have to buy them. We give you them for free. They're available on our website for free. We're updating them. We update them on a regular basis because the laws seem to be always changing and fluctuating, and they keep adding more laws under our jurisdiction. So we're always updating stuff, but you'll get the disclaimer on there. As long as you're doing your due diligence, trying to keep the most updated information, then you're going to be fine. We very rarely, cite for not having, the most updated. If you have something that's showing it, you're going to be okay. Just try to keep up as most up to date as possible. One thing that you're going to see a lot with the sick leave is it's not use it or lose it. Okay, sick leave either has to be paid out or carried over. So if you have an existing policy that says it's use it or lose it, that doesn't comply with the earned sick leave law. You must carry over time from 1 year to the next, or you offer your employees a payout. We just went over the posters again. Our information on our website, we have all the posters. All right. So again, misclassification, this a lot is the independent contractor paying somebody a 1099. Again, not so much in this industry. This industry, what we're going to see a lot of the misclassification is if I'm paying you cash off the books. If you pay workers cash off the books and we catch it, it is misclassification. That'll trigger a referral to the employer accounts, to the workers' comp. You'll get audited by all those other divisions within the department, within the state, taxation, all of that stuff. Those referrals get triggered out automatically. Also, what you have to understand is we will then calculate a 5% penalty that you must pay back to the worker directly, that's tax-free, for the improper classification or by paying them cash off the books. So we'll take their last 12 months earnings and they will get up to a 5% penalty tax-free that you have to pay to the worker as a result of, denying them benefits by paying them cash off the books. Be cautious of it. There's a task force out there. People look for it. People get statements. People talk. People complain. I know I said this in our last meeting in November. I'll say it again. There's probably people here on this call that have workers in their establishments that are being paid cash. It is what it is. I can't tell you anything other than that. Other than if we find it, you will be penalized for it. It's a great.
So you're not allowed to pay an employee cash even if you keep a record of it?
So that's a great point. So you can pay a worker cash, but you have to keep it on the books showing gross deductions net, and then I paid them the net amount in cash. This is referencing paying somebody, just their hourly rate in cash, not on the books, not recorded, not paying taxes, not giving them any benefits. The law just says you have to pay your workers. You can pay them in cash. You can pay them by check. You can pay them by debit card, provided that one time they have the ability to withdraw all of their money. What you can't do is say, oh, you have to go to this check cashing store around the corner and pay a fee. That doesn't work. You can't do it that way. So you can pay cash as long as you're paying taxes on it. This directly involves paying workers cash off the books.
Okay.
Again, this is a great arrangement until that worker gets mad at you. Because I can tell you the first call that they're going to make when they get mad at you or your arrangement goes south is they're going to call my office and they're going to say, I worked for 2 years. I worked 60 hours a week. I never got paid overtime and I got paid cash off the books. And then 2 weeks later, you're going to have an investigator knocking on your door, interviewing your workers, taking statements and reviewing your records and pertaining to cash payments to workers. Happens all the time, every day. Okay,
I have two questions. One that relates to what you just said. What about day laborers for a holiday weekend or a festival?
No. So again, we're not necessarily the taxing authority. There is a threshold. Last I was aware, it was somewhere like $600-700 where it is casual labor that you don't have to, pay taxes and those kind of things. However, if they're an employee working for you, even on a day basis or at a festival or picking up, you need somebody to help with a food truck or those kind of things. If we find something like that, you could be subject to, penalties for paying somebody cash off the books. That casual labor really more refers to whether or not the income paid to them is taxable. So there is a threshold that's not in our jurisdiction. Like I said, it was our $600-700 somewhere in there is what counts as casual labor as far as the taxing. But again, they're your employee. You're directing their work. You're still required to keep a record of the hours that they work, show us how many hours they worked and what you paid them to make sure that they comply with the minimum wage and overtime requirements.
And then the other question goes back to the uniforms. Does the uniform policy apply to a deposit as well? If employee leaves, then is it returned?
You cannot take a deposit. Again, that's still considered a diversion of wages. And then if they leave and they don't give you, that uniform back, you're going to take their money. That becomes illegal. So if it's got your logo on it, if it's, your uniform, your requirement, that's unfortunately a cost that you're going to have to bear, and you cannot put any conditions on their wages around a uniform.
Thank you.
Child labor, again, we kind of highlighted some of those things already. I don't know if you guys want to go too much into child labor. They can work in a restaurant at 14, very limited, right? Maybe a hostess. I would not feel comfortable having a 14-year-old, being a busboy, cleaning up liquor and those kind of things. That's something you probably don't want to, go down. So again, this is another one of those things as an employer to kind of keep an eye on. For right now, minors are not required to be paid minimum wage unless they fall under one of these categories. So food service, restaurants, hotels, motels, they have to be paid minimum wage. There's other, industries where minors don't have to make minimum wage. Again, just be on the lookout. That's something that they're pushing to change to get rid of this, wage order for minors. So that would require all minors to get minimum wage regardless of the industry. And again, a minor can be a tipped worker as well. So you still would just have to meet those requirements.
I have another question. If 40 hours of earned sick leave is rolled over, does the employee continue to accrue another 40 hours in addition to those hours?
Yeah, you found the error or the flaw in the law, and unfortunately, the answer is yes. So they have to roll over the 40 hours, and they have to accrue the next 40 hours as well. However, you as the employer, you're only obligated to pay them on a yearly basis of up to 40 hours. So this is designed to be used. It's not really designed to be rolled over. So if somebody has 80 hours in their bank and they already used 40, you're not required to let them use more. You can choose to do so. You can always go above what the law requires, but you have to meet what the minimum requirements are. So that is a flaw within the law that just basically says you're allowed to keep rolling it over, but they have to accrue more, but you only have to let them use up to 40 per year, even if they have more in their bank.
So after 2 years, you must pay out for unpaid sick leave?
Nope.
Does this is for salaried employees as well?
No. So there's no requirement to pay out for sick leave. You can offer it, or you can offer to roll it over. So that payout at the end of the year is the employer's choice. So at the end of, let's just say December 31st, you're using a calendar year as your benefit year. You have to go to your employees a month in advance and say, you have, 30 hours left over for sick leave. I'm not paying it out. I'm going to roll it over to the next year. Or you can say to your employee, do you want this payout of these 30 hours? Then it becomes the employee's choice to either accept the payout or to say, no, I want it rolled over. So then if you offer a payout and the employee declines and they want it to roll over, then it just rolls over. If there's a payout offer, then you guys have to figure out whether it's 100%, 50%, 25%. You get to choose the amount that you're paying out as opposed to rolling over. So if we go back to our example and somebody has 30 hours left over and they say, I want to be paid out for 15 hours and carried over 15 hours. If you've offered a payout, then that's the agreement. Then you have to pay them out for 15 hours and roll the 15 hours over. So you do get some control over that. You're not required to pay it out, and it is not a terminal benefit. All right. So we don't define termination. We don't define for cause. That's all unemployment stuff. Wage and hour, sick leave, termination, separation is all one thing. If I fire you tomorrow and you have all 40 hours of earned sick leave, I'm not required to pay it out. Likewise, if I say, hey, look, I'm resigning, I want to be paid out my sick time, there's no requirement to pay them out because they resigned. Termination, separation is all one thing. Earned sick leave per New Jersey law is not a terminal benefit.
And Rob, with using an example, if someone starts on January 1st and throughout the year they earn 60 hours, but they used 40, the rollover is only the 20.
Correct. Right. So in your example, though, they would have 20 carried over, right? They would have already carried over 20, right? So they would have accrued 40, so they have 60. So that would, and then it drops off. So you're only required to carry it over one time. So it's not like if an employee works for you for 3 years and never uses sick leave, they don't automatically have 120 hours of sick leave. You're only required to carry over the 40 from each benefit year. So it drops off after 1 year. All right. The biggest thing for minors here, especially in your, beverage association is minors in the alcohol. Let's not give them around the alcohol service, making drinks, serving drinks. We don't want to do that. We kind of pulled out some of the things that they can and can't do. Right. So don't use a deli slicer. Don't use trash compactors. They can't be affiliated with adult entertainment, right? We don't want to get down that road. And then if you're a distillery or those kind of things, they cannot work in a distillery. So we see a lot of those, breweries and stuff like that. We can't go, minors cannot work in that industry. So you'll see here, right? This is the kind of exception we're talking about for the summertime. Only from the last day of the school year until Labor Day is when they can work up to 50 hours in a week. Six hours. They have to have a documented 30-minute meal period. And then, the ones who are 14 or 15, there's even more restrictions during school. During the summertime, they kind of loosen those restrictions as well. All that information is on there. We have a big child labor movement going on right now. We're out there. We have 2 people presenting to schools, giving information to parents, job fairs, schools, all over the place, providing as much information about child labor. You might have seen the press release came out. This is for summer camps. So the Department of Labor right now is really encouraging and making sure that employers have all the best information when it comes to child labor, especially as we gear up for the summertime. this is more, for informational purposes, right? Again, I told you, we get all day, every day, phone calls, emails. My employer did this, my employer did that. We get over 8,000 complaints a year from workers. We're required to act on as many as we possibly can in various different methods, whether we call you as an employer, whether we investigate the claim, or whether we have a formal hearing without any kind of investigation. So just be cautious, be aware, follow the laws, do the best that you can do, and make sure you keep your documentation, because, there's a high probability at some point or another, somebody may come visit you if you have a problem with some of your employees. The last thing, really, retaliation. Again, somewhere along the way, it got misconstrued that wage and hour can handle every kind of retaliation claim, and that's not the case. We can only handle retaliation claims when they come to you exerting a right about their wages, their earned sick leave, or stuff like that. So if somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, you're not giving me earned sick leave," and you turn around and fire them, most likely that's a retaliatory action that you could be penalized for. You'd have to give their worker their job back. You'd be subject to penalties, fines, fees, back wages, all that kind of stuff. So there's a big push for retaliation. We don't handle discrimination. We just handle really retaliation when it comes to somebody coming, asserting one of the rights that are under wage and hour for their wages, their earned sick leave, overtime, records, those kind of things. But they're happening more and more often.
What if an employee actually files a complaint because of the fact that they're getting poor performance reviews? So maybe you've already started down the path of that employee having issues and you've documented it. Them filing a complaint, does that put that on hold?
No, right? So none of this can be misconstrued or should be misconstrued to keep you from doing, whatever necessary it is to protect your establishment and your business. And the only way, again, that it affects you when it comes to our office is if somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, well, I should have been paid for earned sick leave." And then, a month later, you're giving them a bad review saying, "Well, you're not doing your job very good." And those two items can be taken together in the same action, right? So just because you're giving them a poor performance review doesn't mean you gave them a poor performance review because they asked for earned sick leave, right? You'd have to have your documentation as to why you're giving them a poor performance review. These are just examples of retaliation. But again, for our office, it's because they have to be able to establish a timeline as I came to you on such and such a day to ask about my wages or to complain about this. And then, there's that temporal proximity is the word that it is, right? So did that performance review or a change in a salary or a cut in shifts or something like that happen in and around the same time as them making that complaint? So these kind of investigations are more in depth and get really involved and require multiple statements and lawyers and the AG's office and stuff like that. So they happen not very often. But again, just keep in mind that if somebody comes to you and asks about their certain work rights, you should give them that information and really not try to take any adverse action because of it. Don't use it as a blackmail tool, or don't let them blackmail you or those guys, right? You see a lot of that with the people being paid cash off the books, right? If there's a cook in the back or a dishwasher and you've been paying them $20 an hour for 60 hours a week, and then all of a sudden, they come to you and say, "I want to be paid on the books." And then you turn around and say, "Well, you're fired. Get out of here. I'll find somebody else." Now you're going to have a problem. That's pretty easy to kind of prove or justify, as opposed to, something more along those lines of somebody who's not doing their job. And if they asked you for a raise and you give them a poor performance review, that's that tricky situation that we're not really going to get involved in something along those lines.
Right, thank you.
I have one quick question. How many hours can a minor work during the school year?
16 and 17-year-olds can work 40 hours during the school year. 14 and 15-year-olds during the school year can only work 18.
Thank you.
All right, so that pretty much covers the entire slideshow presentation that I had. Hopefully, you guys had some questions. If you think of some, I'm still here. I got a little bit more time. If you guys have more questions and you want to ask, if you think of other ones that didn't come up right now, please let Diane know. And she knows how to get a hold of me, and I'm happy to answer her emails anytime. Give her that information. I think this is a good thing for us to kind of do this every 6 months or however often it is, because the laws change. And I said, our high dollar cases come specifically from this industry, especially with the tip credit. So please double check your books, go back to that hourly rate, and make sure your tipped workers get the minimum hourly rate, right? That cash rate for all those years. And if not, just make up the wages. These things go over $100,000 in a blink of an eye. And these are not anything that can get settled, because they're wages back to the workers, and the law and the regulation is very clear that you have to pay that hourly rate if you want to take a tip credit.
Any other questions while we have Rob?
I see the chat going off.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can we get that slideshow? Is there any place we can get that slideshow?
Yeah, I'm gonna email it to Diane, and then she'll have it, and then she can kind of divvy it out to whoever she would like. So
okay, great.
Yeah, send me an email. Just I have a couple here. Send me an email, and I will send it to you.
Great.
I have yours, Tim. I have your email, Tim. When I get it, I will send it to. I have a couple people here that are interested, and I'll get it to whoever wants it.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Rob. This was an excellent presentation and very thorough. I'm sure it was extremely helpful to everybody on this call, and myself as well. So we really do appreciate it. And yes, we'll plan to do this again in 6 months, and we'll certainly hopefully have you at our convention as well again this year in November.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome. And again, please don't wait till you get a complaint filed before you ask us questions, right? I myself and somebody else, we monitor our email box, the general wage and hour box. Every email that we get gets answered. So as an employer, if you have a question, you'll get a reply that basically says, this isn't legal advice. However, this is what you should possibly do. Please ask questions. Don't wait until it's too late.
All right. Well, thank you very much for everyone for being on the call. There's quite a few of us here today. That's great to see. And again, if you want to copy the slideshow, you can email me. And if you have any further questions, email me and I'll